Sounds good. Okay, just give us a thumbs up when we're live. Okay, just give us a thumbs up when we're live. Okay, just give us a thumbs up. There we go. I've got an ad coming in right now, so all right. All righty. Well, welcome everybody to our 2 p.m. Session for Archeo Gaming Con 2021. Before we begin, a huge thank you to Sarah Head and to Jacob Coffey and Christiana Krupa and all of our organizers for this event who have done such a fantastic job. This is going to be less of a presentation, more of an informal panel at which we're going to be discussing misrepresentations and stereotypes about archaeology in video games, and in particular, how those stereotypes contribute to looting, the so-called Indiana Jones syndrome. So before we begin, I think what we'll do is we'll go around and introduce each of our panelists, and we're also going to be soliciting questions for the panel discussion from the Twitch chat. So I'll begin. I am Dr. Michael Zimmerman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Bridgewater State University in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. My interests include board games, video games, and RPGs in archaeological pedagogy, as well as the archaeology of southeastern Massachusetts. Next up, we'll go to Briandra. Do you want to introduce yourself?
It's me again. It's me again. But you get to see my face this time. Yep, so I'm Briandra Owen. I am actually a cultural resource management archaeologist in Nevada. So most of my work is done in the Great Basin area, kind of southwestern Mojave Desert. I'm a prehistoric snob. Not very good with historics, unless it's your, wagon road or something like that. And I unfortunately know way too much about cans, but that's another story. And I'm just happy to be here. I'm happy to be here with fellow archaeologists and talking about fun stuff.
Awesome. You are also a fantastic hobgoblin monk as well, and I am
thank you.
I'm a wonderful flower goblin. Tune in.
Yes, you are.
At 8 p.m. Eastern.
Yes, be there.
Next up is Rihanna.
Hey, I'm Rihanna Bennett. I'm also in cultural resource management. I'm based out of Florida. I did my thesis on the relationship between archaeology and public education. And I've always kind of been fascinated with archaeology as it's represented and kind of perpetuated in pop culture. So obviously, with my love of video games, you kind of, every time I play a video game, the archaeology mind never stops running. So you're always kind of critiquing and seeing how things are represented in it. You can't stop but take note and want to talk to everyone about it. So that's what I love this group that came about last year. So I love being able to kind of meet like-minded people that kind of spot these inaccuracies and these stereotypes and want to discuss it as well. So I appreciate everything that we've been doing for this con and last year's con. It's been awesome.
Awesome. And I'd love to chat with you more about games and archaeological pedagogy and innovation archaeological pedagogy. It sounds very interesting. And my condolences on living in Florida. So our
right now, it's not fun.
So our next panelist is going to be popping in a little bit. That is going to be Katerina Miniti. She's going to be popping in a bit. She's stuck in traffic right now. I'm giving her a little bit of an introduction so she can just pop right in without missing a beat. So she is a PhD candidate in classical archaeology at the University of British Columbia. Our main research interest is connectivity in the archaic Mediterranean, but she's also very interested in exploring how games can represent and misrepresent both archaeology as a field as well as archaeological data itself. So that concludes our introductory portion. So the main focus here is, as I said, we're going to be talking about the role of games, video games, board games, RPGs, in reinforcing stereotypes about archaeology, specifically those which encourage looting. And before we begin, I'd like to take a second here and give me a yes or a thumbs up in the chat if you've ever received this as a gift from anyone, any non-archaeologist, as soon as you mentioned that you were an archaeologist. You know this one? Yeah, a lot of people have gotten this game. This is the card game Archaeology from Z-Man Games, and I'd like to take a moment to sort of just read the back of the panel here for a second. Discover the lost treasures of Egypt and make your fortune. You are an archaeologist working the dig sites of the Egyptian desert. Search for the right pieces to complete torn parchments, broken pots, and other priceless artifacts. Explore an ancient pyramid hoping to uncover a huge stash of treasure. Trade shrewdly at the local marketplace to increase the value of your collection. Sell your treasures to the museum at just the right time for maximum profit. But beware, the desert also has its dangers. A devastating sandstorm can throw your expedition into disarray, and cunning thieves lurk around the dig site ready to steal your prized discovery. I would posit if you're an archaeologist and looking to sell your treasures at the marketplace, that you are, in fact, a thief not unlike that they're warning you about here. So I wanted to get sort of the panel's general impressions, and welcome, Katerina. I just want to get the panel's general impressions about that, about how that description sort of encapsulates what people think of when they think of archaeology, and how it really misrepresents the field in a way that is dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. I have actually never gotten that card game, surprisingly. So hearing you read the description of it, I'm interested in reading back the stream of just my face just falling at the end of every sentence, because it was that was pretty bad. Yeah, I mean, it definitely perpetuates the whole aspect that obviously we're only in this for the money and the fame, right? Like that's the only reason.
That's the life of archaeologists, fast cars and money, 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 money.
Fortune and glory, kid.
Yeah, that's all we ever do.
But I think that what's really interesting is not just how it perpetuates stereotypes, but it particularly perpetuates stereotypes that encourage looting, and that really create this sort of cognitive disconnect between looting and stealing. I'm thinking about the individual at the January 6th riot who was just smiling and waving at the camera as he's walking off with the congressional lectern, and thinking there's nothing wrong with stealing this, because it's, where do you think this disconnect comes from? Where do these stereotypes come from, and are they perpetuated in games and through gaming?
Colonialism in chat. Yep, definitely.
That's a big one.
Yeah. Well, I think that it comes down to who owns the past too. Like this has been something that's been mentioned in other talks we've had for the con, is do people find a disconnect because either it's being advertised in pop culture that, oh, these are things that are lost. These are things that, you're discovering. These people aren't around anymore. So it's there for the taking. And, the example he gave about the January 6th incident is, do they not see a problem with it because they feel that that's their property? They own it. They own the government. They own what is in the Capitol building. It's their taxpayer dollars. Like, I have a right to take this type of thing. And also, I think that there's a kind of an underlying connection between viewing who is good versus who is bad. So a lot of games, pop culture, usually the indigenous populations are seen as a threat. I know in some of the Tomb Raider games, for example, the natives can be enemies. You end up having to fight them. And then in the case of the January 6th incident, these people saw the government as their enemy. They saw Congress and the Senate and all these politicians as their enemy. They were storming the Capitol for a very specific intention, and when they got there were things that could have really badly went wrong. Like, this could have been a really terrible thing, and it was terrible regardless. But once they got there, it's like, okay, well, we're here. We can't, torture these people or harass them. So let's go ahead and pose in their offices and be disrespectful to their stuff and take things. And so I think that there's that disconnect here, that it's, viewing them as others and then also having the right to that stuff, because not feeling that it's yours personally, that you own it, or that it doesn't belong to anybody else because it's lost, type of thing. And I see Jake just pointed out, the most recent Tomb Raider game did make the indigenous tribe allies, but there is actually going back to what I talked about in my stream earlier, and then what Sarah covered yesterday in her Green Hell stream, is they have the good indigenous people and then they have the bad indigenous people. So it's like, yes, you have allies, but then you also have the bad ones that you're fighting too.
Yeah. I think also a lot of it comes down to how archaeology is misrepresented in general. We have a little bit of that in the chat from Repatriation Station. Oh, so you're like Indiana Jones. You dig up dinosaurs. You work in Egypt. A lot of people also, especially in the United States, think that the majority of archaeologists work in museums or in academic contexts, whereas the vast majority of archaeologists, like you, Bree, work in research management or in compliance industry. A lot of people think that the focus of archaeology in the United States is excavation, when in fact it's written into law as historic preservation and conservation. It's the main focus. I've actually had students who were profoundly disappointed when I tell them it's actually better to leave an archaeological site alone than it is to excavate it.
One of my favorite sayings from a professor that really stuck with me is that archaeology is a destructive science. Like, once you start it, you can't go back and redo it. So you need to make sure, if you're going to put a hole in the ground, if you're going to start digging, you need to make sure you do it right, because you can't undo what you're doing with archaeology. So we're destructing the sites ourselves as we're trying to preserve them.
Yeah. And it's another one that points out, what his point in history do you become an archaeologist instead of a grave robber? There's really, in the end, if you're excavating graves, at least, there's no difference. It's just that as Danger Gurley, points out in the Twitter chat, that it's not. Sometimes you have a permit. Sometimes, if you're doing it right, you're also doing it through active consultation with indigenous nations and descendant communities. But it still is a destructive science and a destructive process.
I think it's not like very clear to the general public how destructive it is, because we always talk about saving the sites and discovering and everything else. But I think that, like, using the verb discovering and using other verbs like preserving and everything else, like we say preserving the past, but like many people have no idea that we are actually destroying everything we find, basically, to document it, right? Because the only way you can find something that is earlier is to take off whatever is later. And which I think is it causes big misconceptions in the public, because then they're like, oh, so how is that different from a grave robber? Like, you go and make holes to dig up stuff, right? So I think that's like probably, I don't know whose fault that may be, but like probably there should be like a better explanation for like lay people of what we do and how not like, just making a hole to find a treasure archaeology is, but it's actually the painstakingly documenting the paperwork and everything. Right, because we always focus on the objects, but we very rarely we focus on the context, which I find it interesting because as archaeologists we freak out about context and layers and everything else, but then when something goes in the press, it's always these beautiful objects, these beautiful things that they found, and we're like, yes, but this layer was perfect, and you never see. You never see. That's why I'm a big nerd. But
did you see the walls of that test unit?
Yeah,
fantastic.
Did you see that floor? Like, right?
It's very different, and they're also not recognizing that it's not one particular beautiful object. When you focus on the aesthetic value of an object, or even worse, you focus on the monetary value of an object. We as archaeologists learn a lot more from, like, say, doing flotation and radiocarbon on charcoal in a hearth. We're going to learn far more about ancient peoples from that, or past peoples from that, than we're going to learn from the beautiful object, because people interact with everyday stuff every day, but may interact with these high-end objects maybe only once. So really, you think about, I tell my students, in terms of material culture, think about the things that you interact with every day. Which do you interact with more every day? The food that you eat, the clothes that you wear, the place that you live, and the tools that you use? Or do you focus more every day on that beautiful statue or that beautiful fresco that's hanging in the art museum? No. So the things that inform our lives are the things that we use every day, that are ordinary, plain, boring even. Another important thing to bring in the chat is, it seems to be an assumption that and sort of an underlying assumption in the general public, that if there are misconceptions, that these misconceptions are innocent, or that they're not destructive, when in fact the origins of these misconceptions about archaeology, to some degree, are accurate based on the history of archaeology and how far back it goes, but it's also has foundations in colonialism. The idea that this idea of perpetuating the archaeologist, the treasure hunter, this is something that cultures do because it forwards colonial objectives. And there are discourses and power differentials in this as well. So I mean, you wonder, why is almost every why is not just almost every, why is every archaeologist in a video game depicted as European, as being white, as being a white individual of European descent? So,
and that's also like, I think that also works with literary tropes, because the archaeologist is the trope of the swashbuckling, rascal that is an adventurer. And so in like the common imagination, if you say adventurer, you think, tall, dark, brooding European with the linen shirt and the hat. So I think that's like, there's more discourses linked together than just, I wasn't reading you, but that was not a read. But I think that also works with like pop culture iconic tropes. It's not just for archaeology, it's for anyone that is an adventurer is going to be described that way, right? And that goes beyond archaeology, but unfortunately archaeology falls right into that. I don't know if it makes sense.
Absolutely. Anybody else about the sort of colonial foundations, the sort of discourses or power imbalances that we see in these video games that employ sort of basically archaeology as treasure hunting?
Yeah, well, you never see any kind of real dialogue or consultation between the protagonist and the people that this stuff belongs to. Like Jake had mentioned in the Twitch chat earlier, the most recent Tomb Raider game tried to do this, but it was still very much this white savior storyline, that the indigenous populations are always shown as being infantile, that they're children. They need to be taken care of. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't know their own history. They don't know the importance of what they have. And it's always depicted that the white European American adventure explorer, archaeologist, whoever they might be, is coming to say that, hey, look, this is important. Hey, look, you have the Ark of the Covenant. Hey, look, you have the Holy Grail. Hey, you have this, you have this. We're going to take it now and go put it in a warehouse.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to the colonialism and to the history and the roots of this field, that it was very much a white field, that we used it as a way to suppress or oppress, rather, and kind of take over and colonize the world, that we came in and it took over things and took claim to their history in that regard too. And I totally just had a brain fart, and I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm absolutely 100% on board with you, because it's sort of the way archaeology is depicted in popular culture is really sort of a continuation of that settler colonialist narrative. It's like saying that Europeans came here and discovered America. They just discovered a place where people were already living and thriving. It's the same thing as an archaeologist coming and, discovering an ancient temple. Well, the descendant communities who were there already knew about it. It's the equivalent of me, walking up to somebody's car, breaking the window and hot wiring it and taking it and then saying, oh, I discovered this car. It's essentially it's the same kind of narrative. But I think this is why, and this is something that sort of came up, Briandra, in your own presentation towards the end. This is why we need to support indigenous archaeologists and archaeologists from minority communities and organizations like the Society for Black Archaeologists or the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, which I'm going to put links for their websites in the chat. But while I'm doing that, just sort of to open another question up for the panel. We as archaeologists love to complain about these games, and yet we still play them. By playing them, are we perpetuating these stereotypes? Do we as archaeologists have some culpability here for loving these games that perpetuate these colonialist attitudes?
Okay, I'm gonna shame myself here. So those that know me know that I am a super big Tomb Raider nerd, and I love Indiana Jones. I love these games. I absolutely love them. And it is a very deep conflict that I have inside, because I grew up with these things even long before I understood what archaeology was, before I learned about my own biases, about everything. And, so there is like this deep nostalgia, I think, that exists. For me personally, I don't know about others. But as archaeologists, we can see these things, enjoy them for what they are. They're entertainment. They're meant to be fun. Sometimes we just need things to take our minds off of stuff and have a good time and have fun, because that's what humans need. We need to have fun. But I think that we do have a responsibility to look at these things critically. That yes, we can enjoy them. Yes, we can be fans of them. But we need to use our knowledge to say, hey, this is not what it's really like. This is not okay. They got away with this because of this. If they were to do this today, it'd be a big no-no. Or using real-world examples to explain what is wrong in the game or in the movie, the TV show, whatever it is. And then trying to reach out and talk to fans of these things. Like, I have a very big following and a lot of friends in the Tomb Raider community. And I use my influence there to be like, hey, this is not okay. Like, and I've noticed that there is a lot more awareness now. Like with the most recent Tomb Raider game, they introduced a lot of indigenous and tribal outfits that you could change into, and a lot of them are pretty like culturally insensitive. And when they started releasing those, I noticed that there was a greater critical thinking going on about these outfits, about what this means and how it's insensitive and why it's not okay. And I think that if we are fans of these things, if we engage in the fandom, not just as a fan, but as a professional, we can help the fans understand, hey, it's perfectly fine that you like this. There's nothing wrong with that. But we want you to understand it's not what archaeology really is. And these are the things that are wrong with it. And we also have a responsibility to try our best, even though a lot of times we fail. Because I know there's a lot of us that have been working vigilantly to try and get shows with History Channel or Nat Geo. There's a lot of people that have tried to work with gaming companies to be consultants, stuff like that. Sometimes we just get the door slammed in our face. But the fact that we're trying to get that platform and that outreach to be like, hey, look, these are all really great ideas. You guys have cool concepts, but you need to recognize that there's a right way and a wrong way of doing this. And right now you're doing it the wrong way.
So one important question that brought into chat. And it's a valid point regarding these games, which is a lot of young archaeologists come into the field because of these games, because of watching Indiana Jones as a kid. So could it be argued that the interest in archaeology that's created by these games outweighs the perpetuation of the stereotypes? Or is it possible to create versions of these games which are still action-packed and still exciting, only instead of actually exploring and raiding a tomb, you have Lara Croft or Nathan Drake attacking a organized crime syndicate that is looting artifacts, and they're repatriating them to their original nations or their original communities.
I do think, and this is valid for games and TV shows, that many producers get around this issue by setting everything in the 1920s and 30s. So you don't have to have the problem of, do we repatriate this thing? Because you can still play the kind of trope of, oh, the people who own these things don't care about them, they just loot them, they're savages, and they sell them. And so we can have the white archaeologist / adventurer / detective like Miss Fisher and the Crypt of Tears come in looking glamorous, looking like a flapper, take the things and bring them back to, England or Australia or whatever. So I think it is interesting. It would be interesting to see if a modern day setting of a game made like in this, climate of awakening about the fact that, yes, our science and our field is still strongly colonized and colonialist, would go the same way, or either acknowledge the fact that not all archaeologists and adventurers are white Europeans and that things belong to the place where they are excavated and everything else. It would be interesting. And I think like the crime syndicate or, whatever association that is looting things, or like even, a hostile government using archaeology to, fund the military, which was another question that we got in the chat and we did not talk about. It would be interesting, right? It would be interesting to see. But I think that many people take, the easy way out and put it in, the Roaring Twenties because it's easier and it's more glamorous and it perpetuates a stereotype. And to that, I would like to add that it is good if these things bring people into the field. But my fear is that nowadays, if you bring people into the field with those stereotypes, you are actually give the impression that the field is still like that, which is not. And many people in really good faith ask us, oh, but do you take the stuff back? Oh, so you're on the field, but you just dress in white and stay under, a canopy and umbrella and take notes while the workmen work. And like, no, I'm in there with a pickaxe. So it's like it's a double-edged sword, right? Because we need to look at them critically, but also be critical of the fact that they are representing a type of archaeology that is not what we do. And they don't represent like what most archaeologists look like. So it's good if they bring people in, but if they bring people in with the wrong impression, then what does it say about us as a field, right? I mean, we are not producing those things, but then again, if we feel like we are being misrepresented, perhaps we should be more vocal about it. Also, like coming out as, yes, I played like Indiana Jones and Tomb Raider and everything else. I'm a big fan, but still, like I question that because I see how many stereotypes are still, like how many people still think that we're like still in the 1930s as archaeologists. So that was a long rambling answer. Sorry.
Yeah, I would love to see more just interaction and collaboration with the actual game developers. I feel like that's where, if we could somehow start to build the relationship where in the creation of a game, they seek out, established, knowledgeable people in whatever field they're wanting to represent to make sure like, hey, is it okay if I show him picking up this artifact off the ground, or just just making sure that they kind of get not really consent, but just information and perspective on how archaeologists do their jobs, seeing if they could bring in people of color or indigenous communities to actually, be represented within these games that they're trying to tell a story or history or loot and show shiny objects for. Just being able to more properly, accurately, and with respect represent anything that they're trying to depict. I think, as for instance, like most of the Uncharted games, they're specifically representing in each game a specific aspect of history. Usually it's with the stereotype that there's some supernatural element, or there's some fantastic lore or legends that it's involved in, but it's usually within a real geographical region location. So I've been trying to research this to see how much research actually happened in the development side, but I haven't been able to do too much or see or find very much. But that's something that I would mostly, in terms of who's accountable and whose responsibility is it, in terms of why archaeology is still have these same perpetual stereotypes that they've had for all these years, is that we just need to develop and collaborate more with the actual developers, like try and figure out how to make a partnership or a balance somewhere where it's just like, I know you want your game to be fun and engaging and an adventure, but there's still moral and ethical ways that you can do it while still making it entertaining.
Right. There has to be a way of making things entertaining without making them strictly colonialist. I mean, I hope, right?
Absolutely. And there are remarkable stories to be told. Like you look at the story of the creation of Nagpur as a law and the hard work and how it started with Maria Pearson and the hard work and the journey that she took. That could be an Academy Award winning movie, but no one's told that story. I think also, to your point, Rihanna, I think part of it is us engaging with the game developers and getting our foot in the door at the game developers. I think what we can also do is, it's kind of like, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the old Reese's peanut butter commercial. You got chocolate in my peanut butter. You got peanut butter in my chocolate.
Yeah.
I think also bringing games into the introduction to archaeology classroom is also important. I can't tell you the number of students who were not archaeologists who took my intro course because they needed the gen ed credit, who were future software developers, who were computer science majors, who were thrilled to see this incorporation of video games and talking about the stereotypes in video games. So I think maybe through education, hooking in future game developers with a better understanding of what archaeology is right out of the gate, rather than trying to change the minds of existing game developers who are just going to, frankly, most likely slam the door in our faces.
And then we also have to consider like the way the gaming industry works. Like recently we've seen all of the problems with Activision, Blizzard, and we have to look at the culture there, and that a lot of the people that are doing the actual work may be trying. We don't really know. They may be trying to make these changes to be more aware, but then as the chain goes up, the people that actually have the real power and the real say are like, no, you're going to do it this way. Or we're cutting that because...
Figure out a way to make it sexy or we're not.
Yeah, like we're not... Nobody's going to want to play that. Nobody wants to play that, you know? And then later on, they release the game and they're like, oh, this is what could have been. And everybody's like, why didn't you do that? That's a great idea.
That goes back to what we talked about with regards to power imbalances. You know, it's because these video games are an industry. They're an industry and they're a business, and the people with their hands in the wheel are not necessarily going to want to steer in a different direction if the direction that they have been traveling is so profitable for them. So I think maybe one other thing that we can look at is how can we create games and create stories within our own gameplay, whether it's video games, because here's the thing is in video games, you are limited by what the programmer has put into the game. But with different things such as board games, to a greater extent, role-playing games, it's a completely open world. It's a sandbox, really, in which you can do absolutely anything. So could we play games and highlight games which have an approach that's more accurate to archaeology in terms of particularly combating looting? I'm thinking about the Bulgarian game that's created by a bunch of Bulgarian archaeologists, in which rather than pitting fellow treasure hunters against each other, you have archaeologists who are pitted against looters. Or thinking about ways in which either an introduction to archaeology classrooms or, you know, maybe somehow in games, we can highlight all of these wonderful organizations that fight against archaeological looting, like the Antiquities Coalition or the Athar Project or the Trafficking Culture Project out of the University of Glasgow. So I don't know if I'm just sort of rambling here, but
let's see, we have a question in chat. Do you feel that maybe it's not that the audience doesn't have interest in archaeology and gaming, but more that the gaming companies are not asking their focus groups if it is important to them?
That is exactly like Katerina said in the chat. That is an very good question. I wonder how many focus groups would know enough, just in terms of popular culture, to know what archaeology really is.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when you brought up doing it in college, like you were talking about introducing archaeology to the game computer programming students and stuff in college, but I would even go so far as, mostly this is my bias because this is what I studied for my master's, is seeing ways, or not even seeing ways, it's already there in, at least in America, through K through 12 education. Archaeology is embedded into it. It's just not explicit. Whenever we talk about history, or like even like third grade, there some, at least in Georgia, which is where my study was done, they're introduced to like prehistoric societies that were in Georgia first. So if you're going to talk about prehistoric societies in Georgia, you have to talk about archaeology, right? Well, they don't talk about it.
You think?
Yeah. So if we could start as earlier of establishing connections with teachers and kind of getting it more explicitly educated within just K through 12 classrooms, like imagine the change that could happen of just having ingrained already, just that basic understanding that archaeologists study the human past, and maybe going from there. But to the question, yeah, that kind of, for me, I feel like it would go to what you were talking about, where the power structure of just like, would the people in power even care to ask that question?
Mm-hmm. And if they did, would people in the focus groups really understand the difference between their conception of archaeology and what archaeology really is?
Mm-hmm.
Or would they consider archaeology interesting enough to make a game about it? We can also consider the fact that maybe people would find what we do very, very boring. I mean, we find it very, very boring sometimes, but
sometimes,
sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in what is it? It's like gaming and user research, which like usually it's making sure that the game is usable, but I also kind of think it's interesting, which I think that question kind of ties into when it talks about focus groups, is like actually using anthropology to make sure that what you're creating is useful for the people that are going to be interacting with your product. So if you're, for games like Uncharted and Tomb Raider, if they're technically putting out a product that represents archaeology, then maybe they should start doing some focus groups or user research studies to examine exactly in what way and what perspectives and how, what is that outcome opinion of archaeology that the players are receiving based on playing the game.
There's actually a great question in the chat from Snicky Gaming. People, I think, turned away from the newer Assassin's Creed game because it turned into more history instead of the action. I know people who stopped playing over the amount of history. I agree with that to a degree. I think the issue there is quantity over quality. There's so much history, and we saw that in our first presentation today. There's so much history packed into each of the Assassin's Creed games that it's not necessarily, including more history or more facts or more archaeology. I think it's about making the archaeology that we do see more accurate to what archaeology actually does. I think that there are video games that could be a lot more successful if they didn't like beat you over the head with the archaeology, but were able to really, because it would be a small thing to just something as simple as highlighting the injustices. It goes back to the first Raiders of the Lost Ark. He comes out of the cave from the boulder nearly squishing him, and the villain is there and is like, well, you could tell them not to do it if only you spoke Jovitos. There's that famous line. It's like, you're an archaeologist in this region. Why don't you speak Jovitos? Why didn't you consult with the Jovitos? Why didn't you,
Is the bad guy the one that has more sense than you do?
Yeah, like the bad guy, Belloc, who's the bad guy in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He's still a treasure hunter, but hey, at least he did consultation. Yes. So let's see other questions from the chat. What about archaeology would make the game/show more successful, and how would we be able to convince executives to consider cultural representation? Ooh, that's a good question.
I think personally for me, I feel like I've played a number of games that they say they're at an archaeological site or an excavation area. I've had it in Uncharted. I've seen it in Overwatch. I've seen it in Mass Effect. That looks absolutely nothing like any sort of excavation I've ever seen. I think one of the areas in Uncharted, they just had total stations just lying around. Like, I swear to God, there was like 15 of them. And I'm just like, who needs this many total stations?
Were they excavating the total stations?
Total station laying on their side. That's a lot of money just to fall on the ground.
Halfway through my field school, the display stopped working.
Oh, gosh. But so yeah, I think
enough to have 15 total stations. I'm personally offended by that.
Gasp.
But there's so much you can do with just one. But yeah, I think just more accurately depicting what an archaeological excavation looks like instead of just having dynamite sitting off to the side of where your player is standing or just I don't know. There's usually, I can't even describe that. It just, nothing ever looks like an excavation site for us. So I think for me, like, I personally would think that I would be like, oh, they did some good research. Is if the story takes place at an excavation site, to actually like make it look like excavations that happened. Like, even if it's just some tarp lying on the ground, or, just something simple that makes me know, like, oh, you actually know what it's supposed to look like. Sure. And not just making a guess about how we do our jobs.
Yeah.
I don't know. It is a difficult question because like many of these games are like action games, so you need to shoot something or someone. So it is difficult because like on the one way it would be like, oh, let's just shoot, the looters. But then again, then there's a big issue like what color are the looters? Because if you say that the locals are looting, then you fall back into colonialist tropes and, we need to save the things from the savages. It's, I would be hesitant to trust many companies into doing a good job with that. At the same time, like I would not be sad if like good archaeology based games would only be like indie games and not like AAA titles. I love playing like smaller games with like maybe like fewer developers, but like well done. I don't think that like it would be. I mean, I can't imagine, and maybe it's my limit, but I cannot imagine like a worldwide successful AAA game with actual archaeology. This is not to, badmouth my field, but I think that like the games that sell a lot are action games, unfortunately. Even when they're based on, mythology and any other thing, you need to have that action part of it, especially if it's like a video game that you play with a joypad or anything else and not like a puzzle game. So I hope I will be proven wrong. I hope I'm a terrible seer in this sense, but I would be fine with like well done indie games, like smaller games and not necessarily AAAs. If the archaeology is doing well, like, yes, give us something like in a field that looks like a field. And, and we have like maybe pickaxes and total station, not 50, but like one total station or two. And buckets lying around rather than, these beautiful wooden caskets that we don't use and wooden crates that we don't use for, taking away, and straw inside of them, which is terrible, to take away the looted stuff, like something of the sort. I don't know if it's clear or if I just went off rambling.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of this, because there's so much detail being put into these games, like you figure how many hours of computer programming are they taking to make sure that people's hair flows just right or that their clothing moves just right? Could they take 5 seconds at if they have an archaeological site, to just hear somebody in the background say, oh, you came down on a burrow, map it. Or, have you hit Paleosols yet? No, just literally a throwaway line. Another question that this sort of begs, we talked about sort of the commercialism of video games, and you're absolutely right. So much of that depends on action game. But part of this discussion also focuses on board games and RPGs, which don't have the same sort of commercial constraints as video games. You can make an archaeology card game as long as it has really good play mechanics. You can make a non-colonialist board game. You could make a non-colonialist D&D game. So why are we still making board game? I mean, we can understand how entrenched the video game industry is, especially when it comes to action. But when you have board games that are based more on game mechanics than anything else, and the actual colonialism is just a set dressing, can we invert that? Can we change that to the point where you can play a game like archaeology, where instead of selling your treasures at a marketplace or selling your treasures to a museum, you're saving them, or you're tracking down looters, or any number of things. How do you a card game that matches objects to their archaeological contexts or something like that? You know what I mean? Like, what do we do in instances where we're not restricted as we are in video games? Is there another path forward?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. Because with board games and card games, there's not this need for there to be like this action packed storyline. Like you're not as directly engaged. It's not like you're watching a movie or anything like that. Your board games, card games are more about strategy. And so I do see how we could use that medium and actually be more successful by taking some of these examples of board games or card games like the one that you've already talked about
Mhm.
and flipping them on their head where it's like, okay, well, let's reverse this. Let's make it where, for an example, make this like a Ocean's 11 type thing, but the archaeologists are trying to stop the heist or something of the museum, or they are the heist of the museum and they're repatriating things because they don't belong in a museum.
They're killmonger, but like without the killings.
Yeah. He had a point. He had a very good point.
Yeah, several good points. Just the execution was kind of villainous.
Yeah. There's actually thinking about that in terms of museums. Do any of you follow Ann Proctor on Twitter? She's absolutely, I see Katerina nodding her head. She's absolutely fantastic. She has a website called theexhibitionist.org. Definitely go to .org and .com and not .com, because there's a very, very different kind of website in the .com. But she leads what are called uncomfortable art tours in England, where she essentially does art tours and deals with the history of looting and colonialism that's found in museums. So that just, when you mentioned museums, that's something that just sort of popped into my head, is like, oh, that's another area where we can even begin the process of rewriting this narrative. So let's see, how are we looking? Are there any other questions in the chat?
There was a good proposal for putting together a document for developers on how to avoid tropes while making games, which would be a great endeavor. And then there's the latest comment is like, I feel like the issue is some people come at these games as the developers want the games to be used as an educational tool rather than scholars finding value in their creative and developing it into a tool, which is, I think it's a fair assessment of like, I mean, the purpose of these games is not educating, right? It's entertainment, which is all like, it's the same. It's the issue that we were talking about. It needs to have some action. There has to be something that brings people in. And then we are finding something valuable, and like we're making them into a tool of education. I think in the ideal world, this would go both ways. So it would be educational and entertaining. But in the business model, I think that the entertainment will always take precedence, as compared to the educational side. I think Assassin's Creed is doing a good job in that. We will talk about it at 4 p.m. if people are interested. But that was a shameless self-plug. But yeah, I think there was a valid point. I don't know if any of you have like more insight on that.
I think I would like to see if the conversation can be had to kind of introduce either common language among archaeologists, like a representation within the landscape, or creating a character that's an archaeologist to kind of at least say like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. So then to at least, straight out and say like, call the person a looter, call the person, like make sure that they explicitly say like, this is not archaeology. Yeah. Like if you can't put archaeology into the game and represent it accurately somehow, then at least make it clear that what this character is doing, what this game
not
is, that it's not archaeology. Just so that we can at least have some sort of distance.
Right. Someone said in the chat before that like Nathan Drake is never presented as an archaeologist but as a thief. Yeah. Like they always call him explicitly a thief, whereas Lara Croft is like Dr. Lara Croft, PhD.
Well, that's Uncharted 4, I'm pretty sure like in the epilogue scene, they have like a whole wall, like it zooms out and there's like archaeology magazines with like them on the cover. So like towards the end, I think they're trying to say like that Drake is like considered an archaeologist, or
is he actually an archaeologist, or is he just like one of these talking heads type of people that we see on on like Nat Geo and stuff like that? The people that really don't have any idea
Yes, you went there.
about the job. They're just the pretty boy that got the TV show, you know, type of thing. And the difference between, and I'm going to be biased here because I stand up for my girl, Lara Croft. She actually, the difference is why I think she's considered more of the archaeologist versus Nathan Drake is because she actually can speak the languages. She actually knows the history. She can look at something and tell you what it is. And they've always kind of had this as an underlying theme in the games, but they really focused more on it with the most recent games, where you can actually find artifacts and objects and it will tell you things about it. In the first one, they actually had some of the documents and stuff that you could find actually told from the perspective of the person that owned the object or from the indigenous person or whatever. And then they later got rid of that and decided to just have Lara tell you about it. And so that's something that I think is good. Like it adds a level of education to the mix where it's not just like pure shoot 'em up, kill everything. You're actually exploring and trying to learn something. And yeah, she's a thief too. She's a terrible archaeologist. Like I as much as I love her, I would not be friends with her. Like I'd be like, no, you need to go jail. But I think that there is a level of trying to make some of this stuff more aware, self-aware, maybe. I don't know. Same thing with Red Dead Redemption. Like I mentioned this earlier, is that there's some things where it's clear they're trying. But either they're just not trying hard enough or there's not a level of knowledge. Like there's still this level of ignorance about what's appropriate and what isn't. Yeah.
Well, I think Lisa brought up an important point in the chat, which is that a game doesn't necessarily have to be educational. You can create a game that is nothing but pure shoot 'em up. That doesn't mean you have to then perpetuate stereotypes. You can create a game that is incredibly action-packed, but if you're not trying to educate, at the very least, stop perpetuating the kind of stereotypes that are causing actual real harm. So I think we're drawing to a close. We have our last 3 minutes before we close things out at 3:00. So I wanted to open the floor for any comments or additions from our distinguished panelists today.
I just want to say you guys are great and this was fantastic. And I am so excited to know such cool freaking people. Yeah, just me. I just want to gush about you guys. It's awesome, and you guys are awesome, and it's just amazing for me.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together. The chat has been amazing. It's been like active the whole time, so that's been fantastic and fun. So I just thank you, Mike, for putting this together, and the con for existing. I just love that it exists.
And for streaming.
I'm the sort of person that you see people say nice things to me, and I feel like there's the old Three Stooges joke where someone comes up to them and says, "Gentlemen," and they go. But no, it's been an absolute pleasure, and so thank you all so much for participating. Thank you to everybody in the chat on Twitch. You've been absolutely fantastic. Just to finish up, if any of you want to continue this discussion, please feel free to do so. You can DM any of us at the Archeo Gaming Con Discord. I would also want to take the opportunity, if any of our panelists want to, just share their social, not their social security numbers, of course, but share their social media information.
All of you to assume I have one.
So, like, for example, people can follow me on Twitter at VTechRules on Twitter. And
I'm everywhere with like at Amit AMMIT_. So you can find me like everywhere. That I always use that username. So I'm always there. I mostly tweet in Italian about soccer, but a lot about archaeology in English. So if that's your jam, then I'm there.
And then I can be found pretty much anywhere under IndieCroftCom. So yeah.
I'm different names. I'm the difficult one. On Twitter, I'm at Remyben, so REMIBEN. On Twitch, I'm Fanthropologist, and I'll do a shameless plug at 6 p.m. I'll be talking about Mass Effect, if anyone wants to join in on that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Please join us. Also, please join Briandra, Lara Croft, Lisa Pola at Morvedra, Anna Kuhn at Short Round, and Daryl at Harasaki Amon tonight at 8 p.m. for our live Goblin Town D&D session, which is going to begin with us in a room full of looted, cursed artifacts, which we're going to have to figure out a way to not torture our archaeologists with that. I have no idea how it's going to go, but
basically stick with us all day. We have 4 o'clock, we have 6 o'clock, we have 8 o'clock.
There we go. All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful, wonderful con.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.